Okay, I know chapter 11 was tough. I get that it was tough, but let me give you some perspective. In May, when we have our exam, we're as likely to see Chinese history, Ottoman history, or Japanese history as any Western history. And I think it was so challenging for people. This was new to the vast, vast majority of people, whereas some of those Western history items you had some background in. But we're going to dive into something upbeat and happy. Oh, wait, totally the opposite. The Taiping Rebellion, the worst civil war in history. Now, to compare it to what you probably know, the American Civil War. American Civil War was 4 years, 620,000 casualties. The Taiping Rebellion was 14 years, and the lowest estimate I saw was 20 million. The highest estimate was 100 million. And China had a horrendous 19th century. Okay, you might be having a bad day, bad week, bad high school experience. It is not as bad. I mean, this civil war personifies how bad it was. Not only did they have a civil war, they had mass drug addiction because imperial powers pushed opium into China's borders, and it got catastrophic to the Chinese. They did it twice, and China was trying to say, hey, please get this out of here. And the West realized if they can hook the Chinese on opium, they can get some pretty favorable trade agreements. Yes, it's evil. I get it. So, civil war, drug addiction. Now, Commissioner Lin Zexu, very AP guy, he was the guy trying to end opium in Qing, China. And his efforts, which was trying to help the Chinese people, by the way, resulted in the first Opium War. And the thing is, because China opted not to industrialize when these foreign nations came in with their industrial power and industrial weapons, it really wasn't a fair fight at that point. And it resulted in these things called unequal treaties. And when you're negotiating, sometimes you're in a position of even, sometimes you're in a position of advantage, sometimes you're in a position of disadvantage. Now, the rest of the world realized China was in a position of disadvantage, and they took full advantage of the Chinese. The Chinese got raked over the coals, and it was a very unfair agreement that agreements, plural, excuse me, that China had to get into with these foreign powers. Now, this idea of informal empire was this term to show the influence of these countries. So you see in this visual here, we have the British, the Russian, the Japanese, the French, the German, and the Portuguese all taking a chunk of China. Now, they had some nominal rule. They could do their own thing to a degree, but in the end, these six nations are profiting off of China. And you can see they're all taking a piece. And that's a big amount of land that these foreign powers were ruling and profiting from. Now, there was this movement saying, hey, we can do it ourselves. Let's self-strengthen. Let's put our Chinese principles to work. But here's the thing. It's a nice idea, and the Chinese people have a long and proud history. But when you are not industrialized, when the rest of the world, or those six powers, I should say, are industrialized, it's not going to work real well. So the self-strengthening movement, right idea, didn't bear a lot of fruit. And hey, why not? Let's have another uprising. And this one was called the Boxer Rebellion. It went on for 3-4 years, more bloodshed, more death. I mean, and at the end of it, the Western powers raked China over the coals again. It was a horrific century for the Chinese. And I would make the argument, historians can argue otherwise, this unpleasantness for the Chinese was because they simply opted to not keep up with the rest of the world with the Industrial Revolution. Now, in the 21st century, China's doing really well, and now they're in a totally different position in the 21st century, but the 19th century, it was rough. Okay, now the Chinese had another revolution in 1911, in 1912, and it was organized revolt by Chinese nationalists against the imperial government, and it brought the collapse of the Qing dynasty, which resulted in what is modern China. So all of these dynasties that went on for close to 5,000 years reached an end after this. So it was a long time. Now let's move on to the Ottoman. Now the Ottoman lasted a long time, and their nickname was the sick man of Europe. And in a lot of these old AP tests, I see a lot of Ottoman flavor in there. So although it's new to the majority of you, we need to know the Ottomans. So the sick man of Europe was a term used because they just kind of kept going and going and going. This is a horrible analogy, but I'm going to use it. Have you ever had a relative that you thought was going to pass away, but they just keep hanging on and hanging on and hanging on? Almost becomes a running family joke. That's what the Ottomans were. So they were sticking around, but you could tell they were at the beginning and the end. Bear in mind, they started in 1299. That's a long time to stick around. Now, this idea of Tanzimat was this reform taken by the Ottoman, which was an attempt to not be so sick, to let's reinvent ourselves to a degree. Let's do some things different so we can become stronger again. We can become more current. So they were aware of their status, and this Tanzimat was an attempt to reorganize and keep up with the rest of the world. And eventually, this group called the Young Ottomans came in. These were reform minded Ottomans who, again, were trying to, you know, keep up with the rest of the world. Unlike China, who rejected the Western world, these young Ottomans said, hey, we better keep up with them or we're going to be falling behind. So they became a little more westernized than what they were prior. And the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, there's an AP guy for you. Now, he was a sultan from 1876 1909. That's a long time to run the show. And he accepted these changes, but eventually he kind of changed his mind. He was eventually kicked out. So these progressive ideas of the Turks, or the Ottomans, I should say, they eventually became the Turks, really didn't bear fruit. And as a matter of fact, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. It did result in one of the worst genocides in history in a few years after Hamid left. It's pretty bad. Now, the Young Turks, this is the last of the Ottomans as they matriculate from the Ottomans to the Turk. This was a reform movement inspired by the Young Ottomans, and they advocated for more Western, more secular, more Turkish identity. They came into power, and their ideas started off well, but it disintegrated into some real ugliness. And the Ottomans were on the losing end of World War I. They committed genocide, even though they have not admitted this 100 plus years later. But it did disintegrate into something pretty negative and pretty dark. So I guess the moral of the story is if you look at this time, the Chinese rejected this Western industrialized. The Ottomans somewhat adopted it, but it didn't work real well. And probably the most successful of the groups at this time that were non-Western were the Japanese. Now, the Tokugawa Japanese, they had a great time. It was a wonderful period for them from 1600 to ballpark about 1850. Life was good. They were making good money. There was good education. Life was good until America showed up. Okay. Now, when Perry showed up, Japan goes, uh-oh, okay, we need to make some changes because Perry showed up and, gave them a really unfair economic deal. So Japan said, listen, this is not going to happen to us again. We're going to be as strong as any Western nation. That resulted in the Meiji Restoration, and the Japanese adopted industrialization 100%. They adopted Western ways to keep up, and it was highly successful. Japan had tremendous success from the time of the Meiji Restoration until the loss they faced in World War II. That's an 80, 90-year window of tremendous success. The Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese fought the Russians, and Japan won, and they put the world on notice. They said, hey, listen, we are as strong as anybody. Do not mess with us. And the world took notice. Like, oh, they beat Russia? Okay, Japan's real deal. They're a major player. We're not going to mess with them. So sometimes you have to do that. So anyway, I'm fully aware that Chinese history, Ottoman history, Japanese history was new to you, but let me try to house it in a broader context. During the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution came in. They came in economically, commodities, but also in terms of weaponry and whatnot. The Chinese rejected it, had a very hard century. The Ottomans, comme ci, comme ça, they somewhat did. Okay, and then the Japanese took it, to the, highest level of just being westernized, being industrialized, and having a lot of success because of it. So if you look at it like that, these three groups of people had a choice. They chose very differently. They had different outcomes. Hopefully that simplifies the gist of chapter 11 here at the end. So anyway, thank you for watching.